Hello there, friends and neighbors. Thanks for coming back to my channel. This is me, Stella Hendricks, and today we're going to do part 2 of The Wild Rose, Notorious Prostitute of Virginia City, Nevada by Barbara Hegne. Alright. It wasn't unusual for the prostitutes to help each other in life and death. When prostitute Frankie Doll, whose real name was Mary Frances Gordon, died in destitute circumstances alone in her house, she was taken to the county and given the usual pauper's burial, a shallow grave in the potter's field, an old cart, and a rough redwood coffin. The newspaper reported Frankie's situation seems to have died utterly destitute, with no friends to soothe her in her last hours or to take charge of her remains. When this news reached the ears of her old friends on D Street, friends who had known her in her early days of prosperity, they became determined to give her a decent Christian burial. A subscription paper was circulated along D Street, and $115 was raised. An impressive funeral was held for Frankie. The woman lay in a rosewood casket, dressed in a white shroud, with her hands clasping a bunch of flowers upon her breast. At the head of the coffin, wax candles were burning. A number of women were present, visibly impressed with the solemnity of death, and one who was a near relative of the deceased threw herself upon the coffin and wept piteously. Father McGrath conducted the services with a few passages from Scripture and prayer. The hearse was taken to the cemetery, followed by a line of carriages. Before she died, Frankie had requested that she be buried under her given name, and Mary Frances Gordon was inscribed upon the coffin plate. With all the notoriety at Rose's house, her name was constantly appearing in the local newspapers, and the news was always bad. At a meeting of the Board of Aldermen, one member brought up Rose's brothel, saying, Rose Benjamin had a notorious nuisance on D Street, known as Rose Benjamin's Dance House, and he suggested the board suppress the house by taking away the license. The mayor said that the city ordinances required that the keeper of a disorderly house needed to be convicted of a misdemeanor before his or her license could be revoked. The mayor said a license could be withheld but not taken away unless on a previous conviction of a misdemeanor. So, Rose was allowed to continue her business. Police officers on trial. In 1876, the entire police department was under investigation for cruelty, taking bribes, and various other charges. Several prostitutes were called to testify against the officers and the police captain. Rose was sworn in to testify, and she claimed that Officer Walker had gone into one of her rooms and stole a purse and $20 gold piece. She said she confronted Officer Walker, and he said one of her girls had stolen it. The accused girl was searched and nothing was found on her. Later, Officer Walker confessed to stealing the purse, and it was found on the road where he had thrown it. Nothing was done to Officer Walker. In addition, one of Rose's girls, Frankie Jordan, was accused of stealing $80. Captain Ilby came to Rose's place and arrested her. While there, and in front of Rose and other prostitutes, he told Frankie if she gave him $40 that he would let her go free. Frankie did not have the money, so Captain Ilby took her to jail. Other prostitutes claimed brutal and unfair treatment by Captain Ilby and his officers. After a long trial, Captain Ilby was fired and several other officers were reprimanded. Rose tried to keep out of the limelight, but situations continued to plague her. In April 1877, Snorky, the Virginia City bootblack, was living it up at Rose's place, drinking and having a party. He finally had a few drinks too many and became belligerent. Rose and Snorky got into a heated argument, and Rose took a punch at Snorky's head. Snorky grabbed a large beer tumbler and threw it at Rose. Rose was hit square on the head and suffered a 4-inch gash that sent blood streaming down her face. Rose called for the officers, and Snorky was arrested. Snorky was placed under a $500 bond, then he was fined $40 or faced 40 days in jail. Poor Snorky had to get used to the inside of the jail cell, and he might have learned to not mess with Rose Benjamin. Rose's lover, George Perkins, was speculating and buying land. In April 1877, he purchased a good-sized lot on the corner of A and Taylor in a very respectable neighborhood. Miss Carrie Clark, now married and known as Mrs. Ward, quick claimed her part of the land to Perkins for $1 U.S. gold coin. Although this deal seemed somewhat suspicious, the other partner in the property, Sarah Jane Cooper, sold her part to Perkins for the tidy sum of $15,000. The young runaway. Frankie Norton, one of Rose's prostitutes, brought a 15-year-old girl home and let her sleep in the upstairs room. The girl was well developed for her age and looked much older than she actually was. Frankie had met the girl at an opium den where the two of them smoked pipes together. Frankie had been hooked on opium for some time and even tried to commit suicide purposely by taking large amounts of the drug. The girl told a sad story about her home life, and Frankie listened with a soft heart. The girl said her parents were cruel and made her do all the work. She said she was often beaten and showed Frankie the marks on her body. The girl claimed she was forced to wear a 16-pound sledgehammer and chain while she did her work. When she ran away from home, she visited the opium dens where she smoked daily until she had a habit of smoking as many as 35 pipes a day. She said if she didn't smoke, she became violently ill. Rose told the girl if she stayed at the brothel, she would have to sleep with men, but the girl wasn't at the house long enough to comply. When the girl's parents began looking for their missing girl, they learned that she was at Madame Rose's house. The father knocked at Rose's door and asked for his daughter, his slave. Madame Rose, knowing the girl's story about her father beating her, slammed the door in his face. The parents made such a commotion outside Rose's house that soon there were over 100 people gathered around. The crowd was shouting and threatening to pull Rose's house down. Their voices were loud. "Pull down the house! Clean out the deadfall!" Two men started to force the door open when Rose appeared and said, "Why, gentlemen, why do so many people come to my door?" Through the unruly crowd, the girl's father stepped forward. Rose allowed him to go upstairs and get his daughter. When he brought the girl downstairs, Rose was all smiles and politeness and remarked, "Why, certainly, if this girl is your daughter, take her home. This is no place for a young girl." Only then did the crowd leave, but this incident was a black mark for the mighty Rose and eventually caused her other problems. More of the story came out in the newspaper regarding the young girl's story. She had run away before and was found in another house of prostitution by an officer. The girl complained to the officer that the father chained her by the ankles, and she showed him black and blue marks on her feet and stripes on her back and shoulders. The officer did not arrest her or make her go home. Wow, I like that police officer better than these ones. Eventually, more of the story came out, and it was learned that the girl's mother had been running around every night with a rebel neighbor named Mrs. Duffy. The two women were getting drunk and entertaining men. On one of their rowdy escapades, they took the young girl along, and she was exposed to their sins. Mrs. Duffy had a bad reputation and had recently got drunk and attacked a policeman with a broom. The newspaper described her attack. Mrs. Duffy lives on North Howard. She used her mop stick for infantry, cavalry, and cannon and made it lively for the police. The police arrested her and charged her with being drunk and disorderly and disturbing the peace. After her last episode of terror, she was allowed to take her 4 children and leave town or stay in jail. She left. It was discovered that Rose had another young girl in her house named Bertha Brinton from Gold Hill. The girl was 13 years old and said she was passing along the street when Rose stepped out and invited her in. Rose offered her a job and said she would pay her $20 a month for her to sweep out the rooms. After the girl was there for a while, Rose told her she should have to sleep with the men. When this story got out, all hell broke loose for the mighty Rose. Using young teenage girls in her establishment caused an uprising of the general population. Rose was blasted in the newspaper. "If this infamous hag shall be suffered longer to prosecute her vile traffic in the bodies and souls of children, Virginia City will deserve the curse thereby entailed. The house is notoriously a disorderly one, and that fact alone is sufficient reason for revoking the liquor license. If Chief Breen can succeed in doing Virginia this single service, he will have greatly earned the lasting gratitude of every decent man and woman in the community. Another article written by a citizen scolded the authorities for their lack of control over Rose. To the editor of the Chronicle, Sir, I, as well as many others, would like to be informed why the authorities have not dared to suppress that most infamous old hag, Rose Benjamin. Is it true after her license was taken away she could procure any man to take a license for her in his name, and the authorities allow her to run her den of infamy under such a license to the disgrace of the denizens of D Street? There is not a man or a woman who may have occasion to pass her door but has been obliged to listen to the foulest and most obscene language. It is indeed true that the police are powerless in this matter. Is it true that this degraded creature possesses, as she openly boasts, the power to break any policeman who dares interfere with her cradle of hell? If this be true, I, in common with hundreds of others, would be glad to know who is the powerful city official upon whose friendship she relies. Another article followed on June 9th. The recent disclosures of the black secrets of the notorious Rose Benjamin's house on D Street are calculated to arouse the indignation of the whole community, and especially of parents who have daughters growing up here. The establishment over which Mrs. Benjamin presides is a resort for thieves, prostitutes, and opium smokers. It is notorious for the number of its robberies, and men who go in there are treated as drugged liquors? Or treated to drugged liquors. Okay. Each girl acts as a procuress to the place, and half a dozen pimps are generally at work furnishing women. It is a sinkhole for the dregs of this street, and continually full of frowsy, emaciated, and diseased women who have been turned out of their house or recruited from the opium dens of Chinatown. The next evening, on July 11th, 1877, the matter of Rose Benjamin's license was brought before the Board of Aldermen. They discovered that Rose's license had expired, and Mr. Rawlings moved that in the future no license be issued to Rose Benjamin or any person for her benefit. The motion was passed unanimously without discussion. In August 1877, a spectacular fire burned two of Rose's body houses and spread to her adjoining houses. The newspaper reported in the event, "A blazing bagnio?" Out came half-dressed women lugging out bureaus and bedding, shouting in Spanish, French, and German. Soon a large crowd gathered to watch the sight, and they roared with laughter when a man ran out of Rose's house, barefooted and clad only in pants and an undershirt, with the rest of his clothes carried in his hands. The man was so surprised at the large crowd and ashamed of being caught in a house of ill repute, he quickly disappeared into a nearby saloon. Several men were prowling around the piles of furniture the women had carried into the street. The men pretended they were helping the poor damsels in distress while they were actually stealing them blind. They started going through the dresser drawers until the police officers caught them and made them stop. The firemen finally reached the scene and applied the water to the two-story structure. The shingles flew off helter-skelter and were carried away by the wind. In less than 5 minutes, the fire was out, but the houses were completely gutted. Rose owned the 4 houses in a row and had insurance on the houses that were destroyed. The house Rose was living in was insured for $1,500 and the furniture for $600. Rose and the police believed the fire was started by a disgruntled customer. 5 months later, on January 4th, Rose married her lover, George Perkins. In 1879, they bought more property fronting D Street for $1,200. Rose and George rented some of their land and houses to other businesses and eventually sold land and property. In 1880, there were still 117 prostitutes living on D Street and a few on C and B Streets. Below I Street and down from Chinatown, over 20 Chinese prostitutes lived. Kissing the Comstock goodbye. Rose and George left the Comstock and went to Butte City, Montana. In 1882, the town was experiencing a copper boom that was bringing people and businesses to the area just like the early Comstock days. Rose and George had plenty of money, and Rose was still in her prime at 41 years old. Rose and George opened a dry goods store in Butte City where they sold crockery and notions. They operated the store for 13 years, with George acting as a clerk in the store. Rose and George have been very lucky in their speculation of buying, renting, and selling land. While they were in Butte City, the Comstock began its final decline. In 1890, 29 years after Rose hit the Comstock, they sold their final piece of Virginia City land. Their land was now nearly worthless. They had paid $1,200 for the lot on D Street and sold it for $100. Who would have ever guessed the wild life Rose had before coming to Butte City? Running a notions shop and selling crockery was certainly a change. In 1899, Rose caught pneumonia, and after suffering 6 months, in May 1900, the mighty Rose died. Rose was 58 years old, and although her death certificate listed her age as 38, good Lord, there was no record of her mother, father, or place of birth. All this she took to her grave. Rose had run a legal and well-respected business for 17 years. Lonesome George Perkins stayed in Butte City. He ran the store for a few years and lived in a lodging house. In 1904, George was still working as a clerk in his mercantile business called the Combination Club. He died in 1914, 14 years after Rose's death. He had never remarried. The end. And then all of her reference sources, she's incredibly detailed. And also, she has some other books that we might read a couple of them, but I just kind of want to give them a shout out. Harlots, Hurdies, and Other Spirited Women of Virginia City, Nevada. Rascals and Renegades, plus a few forgotten people of the Comstock Lode. The Nevada Vigilante Hangings, Virginia City, Carson City, Dayton, Aurora. The History of Virginia City, Nevada Cemeteries. Wild Tales, the Early Settlers of the Rogue Valley, Logging the Rogue Valley, and Steve Wilson Era, The Golden Days of Logging. All of those are other books written by the wonderful Barbara Hegne. So thank you so much for listening to this wonderful tale of the Wild Rose, Notorious Prostitute of Virginia City. How delightful. I will definitely be finding more stories of more fabulous and scandalous women, and I will be telling you about those as soon as I can get to them. We'll also keep doing some more like Playboy reviews and reading articles and stuff out of there, but I'm getting on a real big history kick, so we're probably going to do a lot of historical ones. Alright, so thank you so much, friends and neighbors, for stopping by, and don't do nothing I wouldn't do, and I'll catch you on the flip side.